The maintenance corridor behind the Vale atrium smelled like ozone and lily wax, and Daniel had exactly 11 minutes left on his work order before the Moon Banquet's power routing would no longer be his problem. He liked it that way. In-out, no eye contact with anyone wearing lunar silk. He knelt in front of an open panel, checking the load balancer on the chandelier rig for the third time that week. The Vale family insisted on running the antique fixtures on modern circuits, which was like asking a horse to pull a hovercar, but nobody paid Daniel to have opinions about heiresses' interior design choices. They paid him to keep 400 candlelight emulation bulbs from starting a fire above 400 of the wealthiest bunnies on the lunar coast. He was tightening the last junction when the service door slammed open so hard it bounced off the wall. "I need you." Daniel turned around with a wrench still in his hand and found himself looking at Lysera Vale, the Lysera Vale, whose family's name was on the building he was currently kneeling in, wild-eyed, ears pinned flat back against her skull, wearing a gown the color of moonlight on water and an expression like she just watched that moonlight catch fire. "I'm sorry?" I need you." She grabbed the front of his uniform with both hands and yanked, and he had just enough time to set the wrench down before she was straightening his collar with the brisk, furious efficiency of someone defusing a bomb. "Do you have a name?" "Daniel. Daniel." She said it like she was memorizing it for an exam she was about to fail. "Daniel, my grandmother is about to walk into that ballroom and announce my engagement to Corvin Ashgrave in front of 400 people, and I did not agree to this, nobody asked me, and I have 10 minutes, 9 minutes now, to not be single when that happens, or I am going to spend the rest of my life married to a man who refers to his own reflection as we." Daniel looked at his collar, which she had somehow made worse. He looked at her ears, which were still flat. He looked at the door behind her, through which he could hear the low honeyed murmur of several hundred well-dressed lunar aristocrats. "I fix chandeliers," he said. "Tonight you're my fiancé." She smoothed his lapel one more time, and he noticed, because it was hard not to this close, that her nose was twitching in short, rapid bursts, like a rabbit scenting a fox in tall grass. "Just for the evening. Just long enough for them to back off. I will pay you. I will pay you an obscene amount of money. I will pay off whatever loan bought you those very sensible work boots. They're steel-toed. I don't care." Her ears came up half an inch, hopeful, like she'd decided he was agreeing. "Please. Daniel. Please." He should have said no. He had a work order to close out, a supervisor who docked pay for unscheduled detours, and absolutely no experience being anyone's anything in front of 400 people who could probably buy his apartment building as a tax write-off. But her hands were still fisted in his shirt, and her eyes, brown, enormous, rimmed in the kind of desperate hope that comes from a person who has run out of better ideas, were doing something to his ability to form the word no. "What do I even—" She didn't wait for the rest of the question. She grabbed his wrist and pulled him through the service door into the ballroom, and the last thing he heard clearly before the chandelier light and the string quartet swallowed him whole was her voice, pitched to carry, bright and clear and absolutely terrified underneath the polish. "Grandmother, everyone, I'm so sorry I'm late. I wanted you to meet someone first." The Vale ballroom was built to make people feel small, which Daniel supposed was the point of banquet halls owned by families like this one. Silver light fixtures, his silver light fixtures, freshly rewired, cascaded down over a floor of pale stone inlaid with a compass rose and moon-phase silver, and every face turning toward them belonged to someone whose jewelry cost more than his yearly salary. At the head of the room stood an elderly rabbit woman in severe charcoal silk, her ears held with the rigid posture of someone who had spent 70 years never once letting them droop in public. Her eyes found Lysera first, then slid to Daniel, and narrowed with the precision of a woman doing very fast arithmetic. "Lysera." Her voice was soft and absolutely devastating. "You're late for your own engagement announcement. About that." Lysera's grip on Daniel's hand tightened hard enough to hurt. "There isn't going to be one. Not to Corvin, anyway." A ripple went through the room, Not loud, Lunar Society didn't do loud, but Daniel felt it anyway, 100 conversations pausing mid-syllable. I don't understand, said a young rabbit man near the front, silver-suited, jaw set in a way that suggested he'd rehearsed a very different evening. Corvin Ashgrave, Daniel assumed, filing the name away along with the distinct impression that he did not like this man's face. I'm engaged, Lysera said. Already. To him. Every eye in the room landed on Daniel at once, and he had the brief, vivid sensation of being a chandelier bulb about to blow. This is Daniel. Lysera's voice didn't waver, though her ears, Daniel could see them out of the corner of his eye, were trembling faintly at the tips. We've been together for months. I was going to tell you properly, grandmother, I promise. I just didn't expect you to announce something else before I got the chance. The grandmother's gaze moved over Daniel the way an auctioneer assesses a lot of unknown provenance. Boots. Uniform, half-tucked now, thanks to Lysera's earlier assault on his collar. Hands that had clearly done manual labor. Not a trace of lunar silk anywhere on him. And what, she said, does Daniel do? Daniel opened his mouth. Lysera got there first. He's an engineer, she said. A very good one. He built the new load stabilizers for the East Wing. You complimented them yourself, grandmother. You said the chandeliers hadn't flickered once all season. This was, Daniel reflected, at least technically true, if you counted built as diagnosed and rewired after the original installer botched 3 separate junctions. He decided this was not the moment to correct the record. I did say that, the grandmother admitted, with the air of someone conceding a single point in a war she had no intention of losing. Grandmother. Lysera's chin came up. I love him. I'm sorry it isn't convenient. I'm sorry it isn't Corvin. But I'm not spending my life in a marriage that was arranged over brunch by people who've never once asked what I wanted. Corvin's jaw tightened further, if that was possible. Somewhere near the string quartet, a very old rabbit man in a monocle made a small, delighted sound, like he'd been hoping for exactly this kind of scandal all evening. The grandmother studied Lysera for a long moment, long enough that Daniel felt sweat gather at the back of his collar, the one Lysera had straightened so aggressively 10 minutes ago, and then, finally, turned her attention fully onto him. Prove it, she said. Prove what? Daniel asked, before he could stop himself. That this is real. Her eyes, pale gold, missed nothing. My granddaughter has a habit of dramatic exits and inconvenient timing. If this is truly love and not simply a very well-executed escape from an evening she didn't want, you'll have no trouble telling me how you met. Lysera's hand found his again, fingers laced tight, and beneath the table of her palm he could feel the faint, involuntary thrum of a pulse working overtime. Tell them, darling, she said, and her voice cracked very slightly on the endearment, like she'd never said the word out loud before and wasn't sure it fit in her mouth. Tell them how we met. Daniel looked at 400 waiting faces, at a stern grandmother with eyes like a hawk over prey, at Corvin Ashgrave's murderous jaw, and at Lysera Vale's hopeful, terrified, twitching nose, and understood with total clarity that he had approximately 1 second to invent the greatest love story Lunar Society had ever heard. It was the chandeliers, he said. The East Wing chandeliers? Daniel continued, because he'd started and there was no version of this evening where he got to stop now. Kept flickering during the spring gala. I was called in to fix the wiring, and I was up on the scaffold at 2 in the morning because the client wanted it done before the next event, and he glanced at Lysera, who was watching him with an expression of pure, astonished terror. And someone came in wearing house slippers and carrying a mug of tea, and told me I was doing the ground wire wrong. I was right, Lysera said immediately, some instinct for self-preservation apparently kicking in before her brain caught up. You were splicing it backward. I was not splicing it backward. You absolutely were. I watched you do it, and then I watched you redo it my way and it worked. A small, surprised laugh went through part of the crowd. Not unkind, just startled, the sound of people hearing something that didn't fit the shape of a rehearsed lie. Daniel felt Lysera's grip on his hand ease fractionally. She stayed and watched me finish the whole job, Daniel said, warming to it now, finding that the safest lies were the ones built closest to the truth. Asked more questions about circuit load than anyone with a title has ever asked me. I figured she was staff. Household electrician's apprentice, maybe. He thought I worked for my own family, Lysera said, delighted despite herself, ears lifting for the first time all evening. I let him think it for 3 weeks. 3 weeks? The grandmother repeated, flat. I like that he talked to me like a person and not like. Lysera made a vague, encompassing gesture at the ballroom, the silver, the compass rose floor, all of it. Like this. Like I was a name on a building. He asked what I thought about the chandelier's amperage load. Nobody in this room has ever asked me what I think about anything except who I'm marrying. The room went very quiet. Even Corvin looked, for one unguarded second, faintly uncomfortable. The grandmother's pale gold eyes moved from Lysera to Daniel and back, weighing something Daniel couldn't name. Then, slowly, she inclined her head, not warmth, exactly, but a kind of grudging suspension of disbelief. We will discuss this properly, she said, at dinner. Sit with the family, both of you. I expect consistency, Mr. Just Daniel, Daniel said, because he genuinely could not remember, in the last 30 seconds, whether he'd invented a surname yet. Daniel, she said, testing the shape of it, unimpressed and unhurried. You will find that this family has a very long memory for inconsistencies. She turned and swept toward the head table, and the crowd began, reluctantly, to unknot itself back into conversation, and Lysera exhaled a breath that seemed to come from somewhere below her ribs. You, she whispered, tugging him toward the family table, are either a genius or the single luckiest man on this moon. I fix chandeliers for a living, Daniel muttered back. I don't know which one that makes me. Her nose twitched once hard. And this time, when he glanced at her, she wasn't looking at the crowd at all. She was looking at him, cheeks faintly flushed pink beneath the silver light, like she'd surprised herself. Both, she said. I think it makes you both. Dinner, Daniel would later decide, was a controlled demolition disguised as a meal. The Vale family table sat 12, and every single one of them, Daniel quickly gathered, had a stake in Lysera's marriage prospects. There was an aunt who ran the family's lunar shipping concern and clearly resented that her own daughter hadn't been chosen for the Ashgrave match instead. There was an uncle who kept steering conversation back toward practical matters, dowries, land rights on the Sea of Tranquility colony, things Daniel had no context for and improvised through with a shrug and a, "That's really Lysera's area." There was a younger cousin, no older than 16, who spent the entire first course staring at Daniel's hands like she'd never seen someone hold silverware they hadn't been trained on since birth. And there was the grandmother, at the head of the table, watching everything with the patient, terrible attention of a woman who had outlived 3 husbands and at least 1 coup within her own board of directors. Tell me, she said midway through the second course, how does a chandelier engineer come to understand orbital shipping contracts well enough to date a Vale? He doesn't, Lysera said quickly. I handle the contracts. He handles the load-bearing structures, Daniel said. Physical and metaphorical. That got a laugh from the cousin, quickly smothered. The grandmother did not laugh, but something in the set of her mouth loosened by a fraction of a millimeter. And your family, Daniel? Small. My mother's a nurse. My father passed when I was 12. This part, at least, required no invention. No lunar holdings. No shipping contracts. Just a work truck and a toolbox. How refreshing, said the shipping aunt, in a tone that suggested the opposite. It is, actually, Lysera said, and there was an edge in her voice now, the first genuine heat Daniel had heard all evening that wasn't fear. Do you know how many people at this table have asked me what I think this year, before tonight? Daniel asks me constantly. He asked me what I thought about circuit amperage the night we met, and last week he asked what I thought we should have for dinner, and it's such a small thing, but nobody in this family has asked me what I want since I was 7 years old and grandmother decided I'd marry well someday whether I liked it or not." The table went silent. Even the uncle set down his fork. The grandmother's ears, Daniel noticed, had gone very still, not flattened in anger, but held with the careful rigidity of someone absorbing a hit she hadn't braced for. "That is not entirely fair," the grandmother said, quiet. "It's entirely true," Lysera said, and under the table, her foot began to thump, quick and involuntary, a rapid staccato against the stone floor that Daniel could feel through the leg of his own chair. He didn't know rabbit body language well enough to be certain, but he recognized distress when he felt it vibrating through furniture. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the table, not for show this time, or not only for show. "Hey," he said low, just for her. "You don't have to relitigate your whole childhood over the fish course." Lysera looked at him, really looked, startled out of the spiral, and her foot slowed, then stopped. "Sorry," she said to the table at large, color rising in her cheeks. I didn't mean to make dinner unpleasant." "You didn't," said the cousin, unexpectedly, from down the table. "That was the most interesting thing anyone said at a veiled dinner in years." The grandmother's gaze moved to Daniel's hand, still resting over Lysera's. She studied it for a long moment, the way she'd studied his boots earlier, cataloging. "We will discuss this further," she said again, but softer this time. "After the dance." Between the dinner and the dance, there was a gap in the evening's schedule, 20 minutes of milling, canapes, and lunar society reassembling its composure, and Lysera used it to drag Daniel onto a side balcony overlooking the domed gardens, where the enforced domed glass ceiling let in a wash of real starlight over the atrium's careful illusion of Earth's sky. "You're good at this," she said, once they were alone, leaning against the rail with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been performing for 2 hours straight. "Suspiciously good. Are you sure you've never done this before?" "Positive." Daniel loosened his collar. Properly this time, no interference. "I fix electrical systems. I've never once needed to invent a meet-cute under interrogation." "Well, you have a gift." Her ears, freed from the pressure of the ballroom, had relaxed into a soft, unguarded slant, and in the starlight her nose kept doing that small, rapid twitch he was starting to recognize as an emotional tell rather than a nervous tic. The bit about the ground wire. That was good. Specific. Grandmother likes specific. She can smell a vague lie from across a room. It wasn't entirely a lie, Daniel admitted. "I did splice a ground wire wrong once. 2 years ago. Different client. It just came out." Lysera laughed, real and startled, the first sound he'd heard from her all night that wasn't calibrated for an audience. "That's exactly the kind of detail that makes a lie land. You should be worried about how easily you did that." "I am a little." She sobered, watching him in the strange doubled light of starlight and false chandelier glow spilling out from the ballroom doors. "Thank you," she said, quieter. "I know I ambushed you. I know you didn't sign up for any of this. I panicked, and you were the first person I saw who wasn't already invested in my marrying a man who calls his own face we, and I just..." She stopped. Her foot, Daniel noticed, had started its quiet thump against the balcony stone again, though her voice stayed level. "I took advantage of a stranger's Tuesday night. You paid me an obscene amount of money," Daniel said. "You mentioned." "I did." Her ears twitched, sheepish. "Though I notice you haven't asked how much." "I haven't decided if I'm doing this for the money." The words came out before he'd fully examined them, and he watched them land on her the way a struck match lands on dry paper, a flare of something in her eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared, replaced by the careful blankness of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning not to want things in front of an audience, even an audience of one. "Don't," she said, but it wasn't sharp. It was almost pleading. "Don't be kind to me right now. I have to go back in there and keep lying to my entire family for another 3 hours, and if you're kind to me, I'm going to start believing the story I made up 10 minutes before the banquet started. And that would be. She stopped again, ears dipping. Inconvenient. Daniel finished. Catastrophic. She corrected, and her nose twitched 3 times fast, and Daniel understood, with the same clarity he'd once used to trace a fault down 100 feet of miswired conduit, exactly where the short circuit in this evening was located, and it wasn't in the chandeliers at all. For what it's worth, he said, the ground wire story wasn't the only true thing I said tonight. Lysera's foot went still. Which other part? Before he could answer, the doors behind them opened, and Corvin Ashgrave stepped out onto the balcony with the tight, controlled fury of a man who'd had 2 hours to compose himself and had failed. A word, he said. Alone. With her. Daniel didn't move. Whatever you have to say, Lysera said, straightening off the rail. You can say in front of Daniel. Fine. Corvin's eyes cut to Daniel, then dismissed him. A practiced, expensive kind of dismissal, the sort you learned in boarding schools that trained you to sort people by net worth before you'd learned their names. You've made your point, Lysera. The whole room is talking. Congratulations, you've humiliated both our families in one evening. Can we speak like adults now, or do you need the chandelier repairman to hold your hand through this conversation too? He's not a repairman, he's an engineer, and yes, Lysera said, I do need him here, because the last time I spoke to you alone you told me my objections to the engagement were pre-wedding nerves and patted my head like I was a dog who'd misbehaved. Corvin's jaw tightened. This match makes sense, Lysera. Our family's holdings align. The colony contracts require exactly the kind of consolidated leadership our marriage would provide. This isn't about nerves, it's about the fact that you're choosing sentiment over strategy. And sentiment doesn't run a shipping empire. Maybe I don't want to run a shipping empire, Lysera said. Maybe I've never once been asked if I did. You're a veil. It's not a question of wanting. It should be. Her voice had gone low and steady, the panicked bride from an hour ago replaced by something harder, older, like she'd been rehearsing this exact argument in the privacy of her own skull for years and only now found the nerve to say it out loud. You've spent this whole conversation talking about holdings and contracts and consolidated leadership, and not once, Corvin, have you asked what I want out of a marriage, or a life, or an evening. You did the same thing at every dinner we've had together for the past year. I don't think you've ever actually looked at me. You've looked at the veil seal on my letterhead. Corvin opened his mouth, and for a second Daniel thought he might actually have a rebuttal, some flicker of real feeling under the tailored composure, but what came out instead was, This is beneath you, Lysera. Slumming with the help to make a point. When this stunt collapses, and it will, I'll still be here, and the offer will still stand, minus whatever remains of your dignity. Something in Daniel went very quiet and very still, the way it did right before he found the exact loose wire causing a whole system to fail. I think you should go back inside, he said. Corvin's attention swung to him, surprised, as though the furniture had spoken. Excuse me? You heard me. Daniel kept his voice level, the same tone he used talking down a client who'd insisted on troubleshooting their own faulty rewiring and made things worse. She told you what she wants. You responded by insulting her intelligence and my job. I fix chandeliers for a living, and even I know when a circuit's been fried past saving. Yours is. Go back inside. For a moment Corvin looked like he might argue. Chin lifting, the reflexive outrage of a man unused to being contradicted by anyone without a title. But something in Daniel's face, or maybe just the sheer unlikeliness of the whole situation, made him reconsider. He looked once more at Lysera, found nothing there that resembled regret, and turned on his heel back toward the ballroom, silver coat flaring behind him like a door slamming. The balcony went quiet except for the distant string quartet and the soft rush of the atrium's climate systems. You didn't have to do that, Lysera said, after a moment. I know. Daniel exhaled, some of the coiled tension leaving his shoulders now that the audience of one had left. I wanted to. Lysera studied him in the low light, ears slowly lifting from where they'd flattened during the confrontation, and her nose gave one long, slow twitch. Different from the rapid, nervous flutter of before, something gentler. That's the second true thing, she said quietly. Isn't it? The one you didn't get to say earlier. Daniel didn't answer right away. Somewhere below them, the string quartet shifted into a new, slower melody, and a chime rang softly through the atrium, the traditional signal, he'd gather later, that the moonlit dance was about to begin. Ask me after the dance, he said. They had, by Lysera's estimate, perhaps 10 minutes before the chime finished its rounds, and etiquette required every guest back on the ballroom floor, and she used the first several of them simply breathing, shoulders lowered against the balcony rail, watching the last of the fall starlight flicker over the domed gardens below. Your cousin talked to me, Daniel said, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel companionable rather than heavy. Mira. She interrogated me over a stolen bread roll. That startled a laugh out of her, sharp and real. Oh no. What did she ask? Whether I actually liked you, or whether this was a favor. He watched Lysera's ears go very still, listening hard. I told her the truth. That I didn't know what any of it added up to yet, but I wasn't interested in finding out from a distance. That's a very careful non-answer for someone who told my grandmother he loved me 20 minutes ago. You told your grandmother that. I just didn't correct you. You didn't correct me. Lysera agreed, quiet. And you also didn't have to walk out onto this balcony a second time when Corvin followed us, and you didn't have to tell him his circuit was fried, and you keep doing things a hired fiancé wouldn't bother doing, Daniel, and I need you to understand that I've noticed every single one. He turned to look at her fully then, the atrium's mixed light. Chandelier gold bleeding faintly through the ballroom doors, real moonlight easing down from the narrowing gap in the dome overhead, catching the anxious flutter of her nose, the restless shift of her weight from foot to foot. Can I ask you something? He said. Real question. Not for the act. Yes. How long has it actually been since anyone in there asked you a question that wasn't about contracts, or holdings, or who you're going to marry? Lysera was quiet long enough that he thought she might deflect, might retreat into the polished, careful version of herself she'd been performing all night, but instead her ears drooped, slow and honest, and something in her posture softened into something closer to exhaustion than composure. Years, she admitted. Genuinely. Years. Everyone in that ballroom has an opinion about my future, and none of them have ever once asked what's actually in my head. I used to keep a garden on the estate's east terrace, just for myself, nothing to do with the family business, and my aunt had it converted into an event space 2 years ago without asking, because a Vale garden should be productive, and I let her, because arguing about a garden felt too small a thing to fight for when I couldn't even fight for the big things. That's not small. It felt small, compared to shipping contracts and marriage alliances. It's not, Daniel said again, firmer. A person's allowed to grieve a garden. You don't have to rank your own losses against your family's business decisions to be allowed to be upset about them. Something in Lysera's face cracked slightly, not tears, not quite, but the particular vulnerability of being told, plainly and without flattery, that a small grief she'd swallowed for 2 years had actually mattered. You're very good at this, she said, voice unsteady. The noticing. The chandelier fixing and the noticing. It's an unfair combination. I told you. It's the whole job. The chime sounded again, closer this time, the second and final call to the dance floor, and Lysera straightened off the rail, smoothing her gown with hands that weren't quite steady. After tonight, she said, regardless of how the rest of this goes, I want my garden back. I've decided. I'm taking the East Terrace back from the event planners whether Aunt Priya likes it or not. Good, Daniel said. Want help rewiring the trellis lighting? I hear the last installer botched it. Lysera laughed, the real one, unguarded, the one Mira had apparently clocked as rare within minutes of meeting him, and held out her hand. "Come on, engineer," she said. "We have a dance to get through before I let myself think about anything else." The Moon Banquet's centerpiece tradition, Lysera explained as she pulled him toward the ballroom floor, was older than the Vale family itself. A dance performed beneath the atrium's retractable dome, timed to the exact moment the true moon crested the glass, so that dancers moved in real moonlight rather than the chandelier's careful imitation of it. "It's meant to represent honesty," she murmured, positioning his hand at her waist with the brisk competence of someone who'd been drilled in ballroom etiquette since childhood. "Old superstition. Whatever's true between two people supposedly shows itself under real moonlight. Couples who dance falsely apparently stumble. That's an absurd tradition." "Extremely." Her ears twitched, amused despite herself. "Try not to stumble anyway. Grandmother's watching." Above them, motors whined softly and the dome's outer panels drew back in overlapping segments, revealing a slice of true night sky. No false chandelier glow, no manufactured constellations, just cold silver light pouring down over 400 silk-clad shoulders and one very out-of-place work uniform. The quartet's melody swelled. Around them, couples began to move. Daniel had never danced anything more formal than a sway at a cousin's wedding, and he said as much, quietly, as the first steps began. "Follow me," Lysera said. "I've been doing this since I was 6. Just don't step on my feet and we'll be fine." He tried. He was, by his own honest assessment, not very good at it. A beat behind on the turns, too stiff through the shoulders, painfully aware of every eye in the ballroom that might be tracking his missteps back to the grandmother's earlier verdict. But Lysera adjusted around him without complaint, guiding with small pressures of her hand, and somewhere around the second turn, something shifted. It stopped feeling like performance. He caught the exact moment it happened. Her laugh, unguarded, when he overcorrected on a turn and nearly took them both into a potted moonflower arrangement. The way she recovered them both smoothly and looked up at him instead of scolding, delighted rather than embarrassed. Her ears had gone soft and forward, no longer held in the rigid public posture from earlier. Her nose had stopped its nervous twitch entirely. "You're smiling," she said, surprised. "So are you. I'm always smiling in public. It's trained." This isn't that smile. He noticed the difference without meaning to, the public smile, careful and symmetrical, versus this one, slightly crooked, reaching her eyes. "I've been watching you do the other one all night." Her breath caught, audible even over the quartet. Her foot, pressed close to his in the dance hold, gave one quick, betraying thump against the floor, and this time she didn't seem to be trying to hide it. "That's not fair," she said. "You're not supposed to notice things like that. I fix things for a living. Noticing's the whole job." The moonlight caught fully overhead now, washing the ballroom floor in cold silver, and around them Daniel became aware, distantly, at the edges of his attention, which had otherwise narrowed entirely to the woman in his arms, of a soft murmur running through the watching crowd, the kind of low collective sound a room makes when it realizes it's witnessing something it wasn't supposed to see quite this clearly. Lysera's grandmother stood near the edge of the floor, perfectly still, watching with an expression Daniel couldn't read, not suspicion anymore, not exactly. Something closer to recalculation. "They're all staring," Lysera murmured. "Let them. That's easy for you to say. You get to leave after tonight." Something in her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Daniel realized, turning her gently through the final phrase of the melody, that she meant it literally, that somewhere in the last 2 hours, the terms of the arrangement had shifted for her, the same way they'd shifted for him, and neither of them had said so out loud yet, and the dance was ending, and in a few more bars this would all officially be over. The quartet drew the melody down to its final, soft resolution. Around them, couples slowed to a stop, dropping careful bows and curtsies. Lysera and Daniel stood a beat too long in the final position, close, either quite ready to step back. "Ask me now," she said, barely above a whisper. "Whatever the second true thing was. Ask me now, before the moonlight closes again." Daniel didn't ask. He didn't need to. Standing under real moonlight with a woman whose family fortune could buy several of the buildings he'd wired in his life, whose nose had betrayed her feelings all evening more honestly than anything either of them had said out loud, he found the truth simpler to state outright than to disguise as a question. "I meant what I said about not knowing if I was doing this for the money," he said. "I don't need the money that badly. I could have said no 10 minutes before the banquet and gone home and finished my work order without incident. Why didn't you? Because you looked at me like I was the only solid thing left standing in a room that was about to collapse on you." His voice had dropped, pitched only for her now, the crowd's murmur receding behind the closing dome overhead. "And because somewhere between the chandelier lie and the fish course, I stopped keeping track of what was invented and what wasn't." Lysera's ears trembled, not with nerves this time, he thought, but with something closer to disbelief, the particular vulnerability of a person being told something they wanted too badly to trust immediately. "I need you to know," she said, "that when I said I liked that you asked what I thought about circuit amperage, that part was a lie built on top of a true feeling. I don't actually know anything about chandeliers. But I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted things from my name, and tonight, for one evening, when you looked at me, I don't think you saw the name at all. I didn't know the name until your grandmother said it. I thought you were just someone in house slippers telling me I'd wired something wrong." A laugh escaped her, wet at the edges, and she pressed the back of her free hand briefly to her nose, as if she could physically still it. "You're going to ruin me," she said. "I had a plan. Fake fiancé for one evening, thank you very much, quietly pay you off, never see you again, resume my very controlled, very manageable life. And instead you stood on a balcony and told Corvin Ashgrave his circuit was fried, and danced like you meant it, and now I don't want the plan anymore. What do you want instead?" The dome above them had begun, slowly, to close again, the false chandelier light bleeding back in at the edges, and Lysera glanced up at the narrowing strip of true night sky as though she were trying to memorize it before it disappeared. "I want to finish tonight honestly," she said. "Whatever's left of it. No more inventing. Just whatever's actually true." Daniel reached up, without quite deciding to, and tucked back a strand of hair that had come loose from its pin during the dance. Her ear tilted toward his hand, involuntary, unmistakable. "Then here's a true thing," he said. "I don't want tonight to be the only night." They found the grandmother waiting near the head table when the crowd finally began to thin toward the after-dance refreshments, her expression unreadable in the mixed light of returning chandeliers. "Walk with me," she said, and it wasn't a request. She led them to a quieter alcove at the edge of the ballroom, out of easy earshot, and studied them both for a long, uncomfortable moment before she spoke again. "I have watched a great many performances in this ballroom," she said. "Engagements announced for advantage. Marriages negotiated like shipping contracts, because, in truth, that is largely what they are in families like ours. I have arranged several myself, including the one your family nearly agreed to tonight, Lysera, and I did not do it out of cruelty. I did it because I believed, genuinely believed, that a life built on sound alliance was safer than a life built on sentiment. Grandmother, let me finish." Her gold eyes didn't waver. "I watched you dance under real moonlight tonight, both of you, and whatever else that boy's story about ground wires may or may not have been, that dance was not invented. I have seen a great many false things pass through this ballroom in my life, and I know the shape of one when it stumbles. Neither of you stumbled." Daniel felt Lysera's hand find his again, and this time neither of them let go for show. "I'm not going to pretend I approve entirely," the grandmother continued. "You are an engineer with no lunar holdings, no shipping contracts, and from what I gather, no idea what you agreed to 10 minutes before this banquet began. That is not the match I would have chosen for my granddaughter." "No," Daniel agreed. "It isn't. But—" something almost like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "You stood on my balcony and told Corvin Ashgrave his circuit was fried, Which is, I understand, an insult of considerable specificity, and my granddaughter has not laughed like she did during that dance since she was perhaps 12 years old. I am 73, Daniel. I have learned to recognize the difference between what I want to be true and what actually is. Whatever this began as, it is not, at this point, entirely a lie. Lysera's foot began its quiet thump again, but this time Daniel understood it for what it was, not distress, but the particular vibration of a person trying to hold still around too much feeling. I will not announce anything further tonight, the grandmother said. No official engagement, real or otherwise. You are both, I think, owed the chance to decide what this actually is without 400 witnesses and a family legacy pressing down on the answer. But you may finish the evening as my granddaughter's guest, Daniel, without further interrogation from me. That is, I think, the most honest thing I can offer either of you. She turned to go, then paused, glancing back once more, gold eyes moving between them with something that might, in a woman less practiced at concealment, have been called warmth. For what it's worth, she added, the chandeliers have never flickered once all season. You did good work. She had taken perhaps 3 steps away when she paused once more, glancing back with the air of a woman who rarely allowed herself a second thought, and had decided, tonight, to make an exception. One more thing, she said. My granddaughter mentioned, at dinner, a garden she used to keep on the east terrace. Before it became an event space. Lysera went very still beside him. Grandmother, that was 2 years ago. I wasn't trying to. I know it was 2 years ago. I also know I never asked whether she minded, which I understand now was an oversight. The grandmother's expression didn't soften exactly, but something in her posture eased, a woman recalculating a great many small decisions in light of one evening's larger reckoning. I will speak to Priya about restoring it. Consider it a wedding gift, should there eventually be one to gift it toward. Her gold eyes flicked briefly, pointedly, to Daniel. Or consider it an apology, if there isn't. Either way, it's hers again. She left before either of them could respond, silk train sweeping across the compass rose floor with the unhurried authority of a woman who had never once needed to check whether a room was listening. Lysera stared after her, hand pressed briefly to her mouth, ears trembling with something that wasn't quite composure and wasn't quite tears. She's never done that before, she said, quiet. Apologized. Not like that. Not for something that small. Maybe it wasn't small to her either, Daniel said. Maybe nobody's ever told her it mattered before tonight. Lysera turned to look at him, something unguarded and entirely undefended moving across her face, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, just stood together at the edge of a ballroom that had, over the course of one impossible evening, quietly stopped being a place either of them needed to perform in. The service corridor behind the veil atrium was quieter at midnight than it had been at the start of the evening, no ozone hum from the chandelier rig, just the low settle of an old building cooling after a long night of use. Daniel had come back to close out his work order properly, the one he'd abandoned 11 minutes before an heiress upended his entire evening, and Lysera had followed him out of the ballroom still in her moonlight-colored gown, silver hem dragging faint scuff marks across the maintenance floor she'd probably never once walked before tonight. You really are going to finish that work order? She said, watching him check the junction panel one last time. After everything. Force of habit. He closed the panel, latched it, and straightened. Also, if I don't close it out, my supervisor's going to think I abandoned a live electrical job to fake propose to a client's granddaughter, and that's a conversation I'd rather not have. Lysera laughed, soft and unguarded, the public smile long gone from her face. In the dim service lighting, without 400 witnesses or a stern grandmother's evaluation, she looked less like a headline and more like exactly what she was. A young woman who'd spent one strange, terrifying, unexpectedly honest evening finding out what she actually wanted. So, Daniel said, tucking his wrench back into his belt. The act's over. Nobody's watching. You don't have to keep holding my hand, or telling stories about ground wires, or letting your grandmother think this is real. I know. She didn't let go of his hand. If anything, she stepped closer, close enough that he could see her nose still twitching, gentle and unhidden now, no longer something she seemed to be fighting. "I never wanted it to be entirely fake," she said. "That's the truth I didn't say on the balcony, or during the dance, or in front of my grandmother, because I was too busy being terrified of what it would mean if I said it out loud and you didn't feel the same. But I'm saying it now. Some of it, most of it maybe." "Stop being an act somewhere around the moment you told Corvin his circuit was fried." "I noticed," Daniel said. "The foot thing gives you away." "It does not." Her foot thumped once, betraying her instantly, and she groaned, covering her face with her free hand while he laughed. "I hate that you know that now. I think it's my favorite thing I learned tonight." He caught her hand gently and drew it back down from her face. "Next to the fact that you actually do know something about ground wires. You just don't like admitting you don't. I looked it up on the way to find you," she admitted, sheepish. "In case grandmother asked technical questions. I panicked and researched electrical splicing in the elevator. That's either the most thorough or the most unnecessary thing anyone's ever done for me." "Both," she said, echoing his earlier answer to her about being lucky or a genius, and something in the small, private joke of it made his chest go warm in a way that had nothing to do with the ballroom chandeliers or the atrium's climate systems. She looked up at him, moonlight-colored silk catching the low corridor light, ears soft and forward, nose still, foot finally quiet, every involuntary tell in her body settled into something that looked, for the first time all evening, entirely at peace. "The next Moon Banquet is in 6 months," she said. "Grandmother hosts it every year without fail. There will be 400 people again, and possibly Corvin, sulking somewhere near the canapes, and my aunt will absolutely try to reopen the shipping contract conversation. Sounds unbearable. It usually is." Her hand tightened in his. "Would you come with me? Not as a favor. Not for an obscene amount of money, though I notice you still haven't let me pay you for tonight, which we're discussing later. As my actual date. My real one. No inventing required." Daniel thought about the last 2 hours, the wrench abandoned on the ballroom floor, the invented meet-cute that had somehow told the truth anyway, the moonlight, the dance, the foot that thumped every time she felt something too big to say out loud, and found that the answer had been sitting in his chest since somewhere around the 3rd course of dinner, waiting for her to ask. "Yeah," he said. "I'll come. But next time, warn me before you drag me into a ballroom. I'd like to actually pick out a tie." Lysera Vale, heiress to a shipping empire and a family legacy 6 generations deep, laughed like she hadn't in years, rose onto her toes in the quiet maintenance corridor behind her family's ballroom, and kissed him, not for an audience, not for a grandmother's verdict, not for any performance at all, but simply because it was, finally, entirely true. The chandeliers hadn't flickered once all season. Daniel knew this for a fact, because he'd rewired half of them himself over the intervening months, not for work orders this time, but because Lysera had a habit of finding reasons to bring him back to the Vale estate, and he had a habit of finding excuses to say yes. The second Moon Banquet began the way the first one nearly hadn't, with Lysera meeting him at the service entrance, straightening a collar that didn't need straightening, her nose twitching with the same nervous energy as 6 months ago, though for entirely different reasons. "You look terrified," Daniel said, catching her hands before she could attack his tie a 3rd time. "This one's supposed to be the easy version." "I know. I just..." She exhaled, ears dipping, then rising again with visible effort. "Last time I dragged a stranger into that ballroom on pure panic and told 400 people we were engaged. This time everyone already knows exactly who you are, and I still feel like I might throw up." "Why?" "Because last time I had nothing to lose. It was already a disaster. A fake fiancé couldn't make it worse. This time..." Her foot gave one quick, telling thump against the corridor floor. "This time it's real, and I have everything to lose, and that's so much scarier than the alternative." Daniel laughed, low and warm, and pulled her gently against him, feeling the last of the nervous tension ease out of her shoulders the way it always eventually did. "For what it's worth," he said, echoing words from a balcony 6 months gone. "I don't think you're going to lose anything tonight. You don't know that. I know your grandmother invited me to dinner last week without you in the room, just to interrogate me about my current employer's benefits package, which I'm fairly sure was her way of deciding whether I could support a family without her help." Lysera pulled back, eyes wide. "She did what?" "Ears down," Daniel said, tapping the tip of one gently. "It went fine. I told her I was up for a promotion to lead engineer. She said, and I quote, 'Good, my granddaughter deserves someone with a stable circuit,' and then she asked if I'd reconsidered proposing to you properly, because apparently faking it once was, in her words, inefficient, and beneath the family name." Lysera went very still. "Grandmother said that?" "She did." Daniel reached into his jacket pocket, the same uniform jacket, more or less, though this one had been properly tailored for the occasion at Lysera's quiet insistence, and produced a small velvet box that had, in fact, taken him 4 separate trips to 3 separate jewelers, none of whom stocked anything he considered honest enough for the woman in front of him, before he'd finally had one made from scratch out of salvaged chandelier crystal and a length of the exact copper wire he'd used to fix the east wing's junctions the night they met. "Daniel!" Her voice had dropped to barely a whisper, eyes fixed on the box, nose twitching in rapid, uncontrollable bursts. "No inventing this time," he said, opening it. "No ground wire story, no improvised meet-cute, no audience of 400 people to perform for. Just you, and me, and a corridor that smells like ozone and lily wax, which is apparently where all the important conversations of my life happen now." "Asked me," she said, breathless, echoing the words from beneath the closing dome 6 months ago. "Whatever it is. Asked me now." "Lysera Vale," Daniel said. "Will you marry me? For real this time? No banquet required." Her foot thumped once, hard, against the corridor floor. And then she was laughing and crying at once, ears fully forward, nose still at last, both hands cupping his face as she said yes, yes, obviously yes. She'd been saying yes since the moment he told Corvin Ashgrave his circuit was fried. She just hadn't had the nerve to say it out loud until a stranger in a maintenance uniform taught her that the truest things were rarely the ones you planned. Behind them, in the ballroom, the string quartet began to tune for the evening's first dance, and somewhere above the atrium's dome, the real moon rose, patient and honest, waiting to catch them both in its light one more time. Later, after the second dance, after the grandmother had raised a quiet, uncharacteristic toast that made Mira cry into her nectar glass, after Aunt Priya had cornered Daniel by the dessert table to ask, with visibly reluctant curiosity, whether he had any relatives in structural engineering who might be available for consultation on the East Terrace's restoration, Daniel found himself back on the same balcony where all of it had properly started, moonlight pooling silver across the rail, Lysera's ring catching the light every time she moved her hand. "You're doing the thing again," she said, coming to lean beside him. "The thing where you go quiet, and I can't tell if you're happy or regretting all of this." "I'm doing the math," Daniel admitted. 6 months ago I had a work order and a Tuesday night. Now I've got a fiancé, a future aunt who wants my professional opinion on load-bearing garden trellises, and a teenage cousin who's already informed me she expects to be a bridesmaid whether anyone asks her or not. She's very insistent about that. I noticed. He looked down at her, at the ring, at the ears held soft and easy instead of rigid and guarded, at the nose that had, for the first time all evening, stayed perfectly, contentedly still. "I wouldn't trade a minute of it. Even the part where you nearly threw me into a moonflower arrangement. That was one time. It was memorable." Lysera laughed, tipped her head against his shoulder, and together they watched the true moon climb higher over the dome, patient and unhurried, exactly as honest as it had always been, waiting, as it always would, to catch them both in its light.